Gentlemen, welcome to Los Angeles.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
It's good to have you here. First of all, I want to say this is a really great book. It's a terrific, answers a question that I think started in many of our minds with the first two sentences of your IPO documentation, where your founder said, Google is not a conventional company and we don't intend to become one. And it seems to me that this book in some way helps to lift the veil a little bit to help us understand how you manage to sustain this unconventional approach to what you do. Why did you decide to write it? What was you don't need to go out and go on a book tour and write books, so what were you hoping to accomplish?
I guess at some point we had this conversation about the sort of unique experience of building and growing Google, and would these lessons apply to everywhere else? And I had the idea that there's a new generation of people who looks to me like are in this audience, who are smarter, more capable, more flexible, and quicker than the people who they're going to work for. And they're going into these organizational structures that are pretty rigid. And what we learned at Google was having a more flexible organizational structure was the key to success.
I thought we wrote the book because you told me to.
Well, no, in the book we actually have an email where I said, Jonathan, I have an idea to write a book. You do the work, I'll take the credit.
Well, followed by a smiley face emoticon, if I recall correctly.
You are correct. Most people don't remember that. The actual genesis of the book was
when I wrote the book, Jonathan.
When you wrote the book. So the real genesis was we gave a talk internally back in about 2009. I had typically sat in Eric's staff meetings, and whenever he said something that I thought was insightful, which happened reasonably frequently, or somebody else said something, I'd write it down. So I became known as the guy that had all the Google rules. And in 2009, we had a big sales conference, and the guy who ran sales said, we should translate all of this tribal wisdom for our internal leaders. And so I gave a talk that was actually titled, Notes for the Bestseller I'll Never Write.
Well, you're clearly wrong.
Thank goodness.
First, it's a bestseller.
Thank you.
And second, I wrote it.
Good job.
Actually, there's a third person we should introduce, Alan Eagle. Alan, say hello. He actually wrote the book.
And it sounds like it was a lot of fun writing it, too, from the conversation.
There's a reason why Alan doesn't have a mic.
So this started as something that you were using to train new folks or to share learnings that you've had, and in the best spirit of Google, you decided to make it open, which seems to me to be a central theme that you come back to again and again in the book. Before we get into that, I'd love to start with the same way you started the book, because I think it starts in this interesting moment in time in 2002, and Larry is not happy with what's going on with AdWords. And that starts a series of things that you use as a way to illustrate some of the core principles of what makes the company run. And what I thought you might do for the audience, some of them may not even know what AdWords is, but start first by describing what that is and what happened that day.
I think it's easier if I just sort of describe how I experienced this. So when I joined the company, I figured it wasn't going to amount to much, but I really liked the people. And we were busy doing this sort of advertising system that people would click on ads, and I figured that wouldn't be worth very much. Again, so far I'm doing really well. And so I'm sitting, and we're all in one building, and I'm sitting in a little conference, in the sort of break room, where there's free food, and it's a very nice place. And there's a wall, and up on the wall are a series of pages that Larry Page, who's our founder, has printed out, which at the top he's written, "These ads suck." Okay? So he has, a query, and those of you who've used Google know, there's a query, and then you have ads on the right, and he would circle. And there were a whole bunch of them, but an example would be that if you typed, I want an H-1B information about Visa, we would show Kawasaki H-1B motorcycle ad. Clearly not correct. So I didn't think very much of it, and I went home, and I don't remember what I did over the weekend, and I come in Monday morning, and the problem has been solved. I get an email to this effect in the morning when I come in. But what's interesting about the email was it was written by engineers who had nothing to do with ads. And then I realized that I just witnessed a very strange management structure. Because for the 30 years I've been managing things before, you had an ad engineering department, and you'd say, your ads suck, you need to fix them. But Larry instead simply issued a call to anyone in the form of criticism, and then engineers who must have had not much else to do that weekend right, decided to work on it, and they invented technically a vector space, and this vector space of scoring is the basis for the ad system that today produces $30 billion or more of money for Google. So we can date that $30 billion to that weekend, but more importantly, it was not done by any of the normal owners. Now, can that happen in your company? It's an example of how powerful culture really is.
And that's the part that I think I would love to hear you talk more about, because both of you came from a lot of other, you were a management consultant, you were at Excite at Home, you were at Novell and at Sun, and going back to Bell Labs. Those cultures, if somebody posted a sign on the board that said these ads suck, it would have created complete panic and fear. How come that wasn't the case?
Why are you criticizing us would be the reaction.
Right. So why is it different at Google?
Well, I think one of the things that we learned was that culture really needs to be set from the start. And Larry and Sergey started with a very clear mission, but then they explained that mission to people before they hired them. And I think that really created a dynamic where you had a selection bias, where you were getting the kind of people that really believed in the slogans and believed the culture. And most of those sort of traditional management consulting types of firms or financial services firms, they do things differently. They get started, and if they're successful, they call somebody in from HR and they say, quick, we need a mission statement, we need a culture. And you end up with something that sounds like, to build fabulous, unrivaled partnerships with our clients through the hard work, dedication, perseverance of our wonderful employees to build shareholder value.
Let me guess, that was Enron?
That was Lehman Brothers. Enron is something else that was brilliant. I remember it with the acronym RICE, I think, respect. They're so hard to remember, you have to create mnemonics to remember them.
Respect, information, integrity,
communications, excellence. Got it.
I feel like they hired some marketing consultant to tell them those 4 words.
But that's how you do well in one of those companies. You have to learn to memorize gibberish. At Google, the employees actually believe these things. And if you look at Eric's example, the engineers who built the query snippet vector that became AdSense were not on the ads team. They were on the search team. If they'd failed, nobody would have scolded them. Culturally, that's a very different dynamic.
And this way that you look at the values and how they're integrated into everyone that works there, they know this. You play out a scene in the book where you're looking at making a change to AdWords, where there is someone who is practically taking off his shoe and banging it on the table to say this is wrong.
Well, this was interesting that when I showed up, and I think you had the same reaction, we had this phrase, don't be evil.
Right.
And I figured this was like our equivalent of these Enron things, right? In other words, it was like a marketing phrase, and I'm an engineer, so you just ignore marketing, right? Sorry. So I'm sitting in the room, and there's a proposed change to the advertising and search interface, and I didn't really understand the details. And one of the engineers, his name is Ron, all of a sudden says, "That's evil," and he pounds the table. And I'm sitting at the end of the table. They're like here. It's all very small, and I thought, "Oh my God!" Everything stopped. So now everyone ignores the clock. There's this huge food fight between all the various players because they've been accused of, the equivalent of a crime. And eventually it was agreed to withdraw the change. So all of a sudden I realized it wasn't just a marketing thing, and I eventually figured out, those of you know that there's this thing called the Kanban system in Japan where anybody in the manufacturing line can pull the plug if in their view the quality of the car or whatever is that they're building is of insufficiently quality to let it go to the next stage. And this is a major innovation in manufacturing. This was the same thing. So the don't be evil turned out to have a meaning because it empowered employees in a way that they were not in any of my previous companies.
Yeah. I think the litmus test of kind of any cultural lodestar is, can it guide employees if they're in a kitchen late at night by themselves and thinking about what they should work on, or if they're in a meeting and they fundamentally disagree with the direction the company's taking?
So it sounds totally right, but as a leader, I have to think that there are times when everything doesn't align. I mean, you lay out a situation in the book about China and how you have dealt with that.
So there's a lot of theories about how to manage, and we ultimately, and did this fairly early, did something roughly like this. First place, you really don't want, Jonathan, you have this term called hippo. Can you explain this, and then I'll return to my narrative?
You could be a hippo, but we reformed you. Hippos are actually the most dangerous animals in the world. They kill more people in the wild. In companies, they kill more smart creatives, which is kind of the archetype in our book for creative engineers. And a hippo is the highest paid person's opinion. What you want to do is create a meritocracy where anyone can win an argument. And at Google, if you try to win an argument by experience, someone's going to say, well, let our peers be the judge. I will argue with you, and you will argue with me, and they will judge whether or not your experience allowed you to produce a better argument.
So for many years, I've always believed this, but even I slip into the old behavior. I remember being in a sales meeting with the CEO and senior executives of a very important consumer company, a big, big partnership. And I'm doing the usual, you're nice, we love you, and they're doing the nice, we love you back. And I really didn't know anything about what I was saying, but I was looking good. And then at some point, there was a question, and this very young lady, who I would estimate would be in her mid-20s, 24, 25, answered the question. And all of a sudden I said, holy crap, this is the smartest person in the room. Right? All the guys have been talking, right? Making sort of guy behaviors. I'm the VP of this, and I'm the VP of that, and you're in charge, and
a lot of posturing.
Yeah, all the sort of posturing that goes on in these meetings. And there's this one person who's sitting at the end who actually knows the answer to every question precisely. And so I said, "Shut up, Eric." Sorry, to myself, and tried to get her to talk about how we would go make billions of dollars together. It's so easy to fall into these old traps. So in the Google culture, we would have these meetings, and the basic idea was try to get everybody to talk. And if you didn't have a proper conversation, you didn't really get it settled. I had some experience in Novell, which was something called the Novell nod, which meant that everyone would say yes, and then as they left the room, they'd go do whatever they wanted, right? Didn't work. So we developed a model where everybody had to participate, and there had to be a serious argument. So somebody's got to take one side of the position, and somebody's got to take the other position, and your job running the meeting is to get that to happen. Now, if it happens just by itself, in and of itself, you have a university. They're just arguing, right? So you need a deadline. So the job of manager is to establish a deadline. You mentioned the China example. I knew when we went into the China conversation, we had been attacked by the Chinese government and all that. I knew what the outcome was going to be, because I sort of knew the players enough, and I'd done sort of my own assessment. But I thought it was important to have a process that everyone could report was seen as was involving. Jonathan, you were there. You can describe what we actually did.
Well, Eric actually brought everyone into the room. He called us, it was a Sunday late, and he brought us all in, and Sergey actually got up and described what had actually happened, the whole hacking incident. And it was actually clear that it was, to some degree, a fait accompli. The founders, at this point, both the founders, Sergey had historically been against our being in China pretty clearly, but Larry was now leaning with Sergey. So if Eric wanted to stay in China, his hopes were kind of doomed either way. But he actually forced this meeting. We all came in, we went through all of the facts, and then he went around to each of the managers in the room and had everybody express their opinion and effectively vote. I actually didn't support you.
I know.
You remember these things. There were two people.
I remember very well who supported me and who didn't.
Yes.
So we're clear.
I chickened out. And at the end of that evening, it was clear that we'd come to the outcome that was expected, but Eric had run a process that we all remembered. And
so the important thing was, at that point, we got a major, major decision in the corporation to get done in 48 hours. But everyone who left the room, even the people who disagreed, and it was a majority agreed and a minority disagreed, so that's sort of a good outcome. But everybody knew their marching orders, and they knew exactly what to do, and we had to go and make it happen. So sometimes leadership is about getting people who are reluctant or recalcitrant over something, and getting the naysayers to say, so I would say, do you think you can live with this? And after you've beaten them up for an hour, they can usually say, okay, whatever.
And you wrote, or Alan wrote in that section that
Ooh,
also.
I wrote this.
That's right. Smiley face.
Please continue.
You did write the strategy insert.
You only gave me 2 pages.
They're your
2
favorite
pages that I wrote.
pages.
Two pages of gold. But you said that even when you made that decision, the Chinese government thought you were joking at first. I mean, that's a very bold move to make and to go through that process.
Again, I think the reasons that Google did this have been well covered and well documented in 2010. We just simply did not like their censorship regime. But to me, the narrative is that companies make decisions all the time, and big companies make important ones all the time. They merge, they split, they do all sorts of odd things. But you've got to have a process where there's buy-in at a basic level. People have to believe it because they have to sell it.
And it comes back to the culture. One of the things I think would be very interesting for our audience to hear, and I found particularly fascinating, is the focus, almost manic focus you have on interviewing. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about what that process, how does Google interview, and how is it different than the way others go at that?
Sure. It depends which department you're speaking to, but at least in product management, as I interview people, it's very much, we have a set of things. They're the traditional things, role-related knowledge and experience relative to the job. But we focus very much on passion, because I think one of the things that we've learned is that passion is the one thing that you can't teach. I can teach somebody management. I can teach somebody about a market. But you can't teach the type of person who's passionately curious. So I always focus on finding what that passion is. When you get people talking about their passion, they kind of let their guard down and they get really excited and they can go deep. If they can't go deep, then they're probably not passionate.
Well, and so this also gives you sort of a marketing detector. Are you being marketed to by somebody who's just repeating the slogans, or do they have some real insights?
Yeah. The other thing that we look at is we tend to believe that in technology, the world is changing so quickly that you want great generalists as opposed to specialists. Specialists tend to come at problems with their own inherent bias based on what their specialty is. So we tend to look for people who are great generalists, and they're the kind of people who, as we say in the book, pass what we call the LAX test. I've been stuck with Eric in the equivalent of LAX for 3 weeks. We haven't killed each other yet. You want
I'm sorry we chose LAX Airport, but everyone here in this room really does understand. So the test is, if you're stuck in the LAX Airport for 6 hours, 6 hours.
It's a long time.
It's a long time, Larry, right?
It is.
Right.
We're not talking about a club room necessarily.
No.
We're just talking about 6. At the end of that 6.
It was before smartphones.
Right.
You actually have to
Talk to them.
You have nothing to do.
Right.
Yes. That's right. We invented smartphones after we invented the LAX test. It was much worse back then. Now I'll just get on my phone and ignore you for 6 hours. But in any case, the basic question is, could you be in an airport stuck there for 6 hours, and at the end of that 6 hours, do you have anything to say to them at all? Right? Or are you just so disgusted with them? And it's a very, very tough test.
But here's the part that I find fascinating. I get that, but you're taking some of your most valuable engineers, people that can go out and make you money every minute, and you're putting them in as a trusted interviewer. And maybe if you could talk just a little bit about what does it take to be a trusted interviewer? And I was really fascinated by the fact that you can be challenged as an incumbent trusted interviewer. Sure. and booted out.
So in the beginning, everybody interviewed. And we were growing very quickly, and people were complaining that they had to interview too much. And Larry came out and said, I don't understand what everyone's complaining about. If you stop delegating all the hiring to recruiters, and you all just focus on hiring, and each one of you, each quarter, hires one person, doesn't that mean we'll double each quarter? And his math checked. So, as it usually does. So in the beginning, everyone was responsible for interviewing. And that allowed us to create a dynamic where people were committed to hiring everyone who was on the team. We then, as we grew, we then discovered not everyone was really good at interviewing, and not everyone wanted to interview. So we created a program called the Trusted Interview Program, and on my team, we actually gave people performance review bumps if they interviewed a sufficient number of people. And you had to get onto the Trusted Interview Program like you would apply to go up a tennis ladder. And if people stopped doing a good job, they were taken off, and that actually adversely impacted their performance. So we made interviewing an integral part of people's success on the job.
And of your evaluation. But I have an important piece of data, which is that it's possible to overdo this. One day, Jonathan ran this process with a lady and a gentleman, and the three of them ran the sort of the whole pyramid of all of this. And they would make the final decisions, and they bring this fellow to me, and we've interviewed him 16 times. And I said to Jonathan, like, you can't decide? And I said, no, we're about to reject him. And I said, what? And we liked this person, but we didn't like him enough. So we rejected him. And so I said, okay, we're going to have a maximum amount of torture that you guys are going to do to these poor people. And the answer was 8. 8 interviews. You can't do more than 8 interviews. We then studied this for a while, and we figured out that 5 interviews for between 30 and 45 minutes was statistically enough to get a decision. So there is some science to this. So you can, each of you in your corporations, but make sure you put a max, and make sure you correlate it with success. We measure all of these things.
And you even measured the success of the interviewers, correct? I mean, they had statistics too.
We do, and one of the things that we talk about in the book is the way the interviewers rate people. They rate people on a scale of 1 to 4. And 1, it's interesting, the definition of these terms. 1 means, if the hiring committee wants to hire this person, please call me so that I can come in when they're making that decision and argue them into submission.
In other words, we do not
want to hire. I do not want to hire.
I am not going to let this person come into this company.
4 means, if the knuckleheads on the hiring committee are going to come say no, please call me so that I can change your mind. So what happened? Some interviewers just gave everyone a 3. So we actually have data that shows the mean and the variance of each interviewer so that you can figure out, as you're going through the packet, whether or not you should discount that person's input.
Mathematically, what Jonathan is saying is they normalize the results. So if you're one of these people, and many of you are, you probably give mostly 3.4 and 3.1 and 2.7. We'll just normalize all that. So you can't escape our rating system.
Big data. Let me ask you.
It's what we do.
It's what you do. Knaves, Knights, and Divas. What's that about?
So in the Google environment, people tend to work in small teams. We've discovered that small engineering teams can actually get a lot done. And they tend to be in relatively small spaces, like 3 or 4 people in a garage. And when you have small numbers of people in small spaces, you get kind of built-in social controls. And if you get someone who is what we call a knave, knaves are like bad eggs, right? They lie, they steal, they cheat, they take credit for somebody else's work. Did you write a book?
No, I did not. You misheard me. Alan wrote the book.
Oh, thank you. So if you get a tipping point in a small team in knave density, then you're doomed.
This is how we talk at Google. We talk about knave density, vectors.
So life becomes miserable. So what you want the team to do is, to some degree, get rid of the knave. And if they're not, they need to come to management, and management needs to help them. Now, take the other extreme, divas. If you have small, tightly knit teams, the team and the social controls can also drive out a diva. Divas are brilliant, but they can be very difficult to work with. They can sort of, feel like they're exceptional and different and need to be treated differently. You actually need some of those people in the company. So Eric wrote, exile knaves and fight for divas.
This is your phrase.
That's
Alan's phrase. In any case, one of the things that you learn about companies is you need these diva-type people, and they're sort of obnoxious, right? They push, they're aggressive, and they're strong, and they lead teams, and they're inspirational, and they're not necessarily nice, but they're important. And we say protect the divas, because they're the people who actually contribute to building a great product.
I mean, that's the complete opposite of conventional wisdom, which is the
you
divas need to be...
You have them in Hollywood.
No, I'm sure that there's a few divas in Hollywood. But the interesting thing about Hollywood is Hollywood tolerates this because there are clearly defined roles, right? So if you have a diva director who happens to be a hugely creative and successful person, people will put up with their behavior. But in traditional industries, right, this is sort of typically not tolerated. And if you get rid of all the knaves and all the divas, you get the government.
Right.
Right? You know, everything's kind of the same, it's kind of low-key.
Well said. Because we want to get to questions soon, I wanted to switch gears and talk a little bit about, you write a great deal in here about innovation, which I would expect. Maybe, how does Google define innovation? How do you approach that?
Well, I think it's just frankly new stuff. And I mean,
But in the book you say it's more than just being new. You have criteria.
Say new, surprising, and radically useful.
But if you look at progress in in sort of all progress in humanity has ultimately started from some form of technological invention or progress in that same. And these are often things which are very surprising, whether it's the discovery of the wheel or the discoveries that Google X is doing. And our position is that you shouldn't do something which is 10% better. Most businesses are stable and, you know, the car is 5% better or 4% or whatever. Why don't you build a car that's 10 times better? Now, by the way, that might be an unreasonable goal. Maybe you'll fail and produce a car that's 3 times better. Well, you'll sell out of that car in a sec. So in a technological invention business, you have to set really high goals, and then you have to really push people to get to them.
And that comes up again and again in what you wrote, is that it's got to be bigger, right? Think bigger. But you also say that as you're thinking about innovation, a central part of that is it has to be feasible, or it has to be, you even argue at some points that you should go after markets that are already developed. It seems like most innovators are looking for the market that doesn't exist. Why would you look at things that are already out there?
Well, the best scenario is you invent something brand new that solves an existing problem in a new way in a very large market.
Right.
So imagine that you're the person who's invented the electric toothbrush for the first time. And the electric toothbrush costs the same as the manual toothbrush, and it fights cavities, and everybody loves it, right? That's an innovation. We see these things all the time, right? We just forget about it. What's one that's recently been invented was Uber, right? Another one that was recently invented was Instagram, which is about self-esteem, right? There's no dislike button.
If you think
there's no dislike button, and
Jonathan refused to promote the founders of Instagram.
Sadly, I did. Kevin Systrom used to work for us, and he wanted to transfer from marketing into our associate product management program. And I said no. And he founded Instagram. And Eric likes to remind me of this.
And following the Google procedures, he has been apologizing ever since. But again, part of the way Google works is, you know, you have to admit your mistakes, Jonathan.
I made a mistake, Eric. But just to go back to your question about innovation, typically when MBAs kind of put a vision of what the company should do, they're very focused on, well, here's this big greenfield market. Here's this big opportunity. And the reason this market is green is it's probably not big. But if you look at using technology to attack existing large markets, and you actually have some technical insight behind what you're doing, a technical insight, which we talk about in the book, is the kind of thing that might appear in a journal article. You can come into an existing market, attack it, and usurp all of the existing players. Look at Google Search, right? What was the technical insight? PageRank. Look at Google Ads. What was the technical insight? Price times click-through rate, the ability to rank ads based on their relevance. Look at Chrome, right? Chrome came into a market with existing players, but it was more secure and it was faster. Maps, kind of draggable, droppable mirror on the world. And Maps and local are now a huge business for us. So innovation can be about these big 10x type of projects, but if it isn't those, then it's about a technical insight that allows you to take over an existing market. Netflix versus Blockbuster, Amazon versus Borders.
And that technical insight is something that you argue is more important than any other kind of business planning. You even say, though you might not know my industry, you can tell me that if I have a business plan, it's probably wrong. What's that about?
Well, very few companies have what Eric calls a clear 5-year vision. And if they're not looking at all of the dynamics with respect to how technology is making information free, how the whole distribution dynamic is changing with mobile, companies can reach customers, consumers can reach each other. Eric's Uber question, which the taxi industry missed, right? Someone who needs a taxi can find a taxi. If you're not looking at those technological trends, if you're not looking at the fact that cloud computing is now practically free or extremely cheap, then somebody else is going to come in and take one of those technologies and fundamentally turn your industry upside down.
And you talk a little bit about the differences in the way Google might approach some of those challenges versus, you give the example of Android versus Apple and an open system versus a closed system. There's been a lot written about this, but it seems to me in what you share in the book that open is not just an approach to building platforms, it permeates everything that's going on in the way Google looks at the business. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think it is. I think open is really about trading off a little bit of intellectual property for the opportunity to expeditiously expand the pie. And
for this audience, I think we should probably explain that if you would like to build a mobile phone, you may use the operating system source code for Android that's free. Should you call up Apple and ask them for that source code, their lawyer will be calling you back.
So there's open software, but there's also open information and transparency that we espouse quite a bit internally. We also believe that you want to force engineering teams to keep the products open so that you're not locking in customers. Most companies sort of think about aggressively locking people in as opposed to make it easy for them to get out. We have an entire team, a data transparency team, whose job is to make sure that if you want to take your contacts or you want to take your information out of Google, you can. And it's amazing the kind of impact that that has on an engineering team. The engineering team in an open model has to stay ahead of everybody that's in the industry at a time when, if they're doing a good job, more application developers and more people are flooding into their industry because their platform is successful. That's a completely different dynamic from traditional closed models.
But you make decisions strategically not to be open. Like search is not open.
We want to distinguish between all the source code being available. There certainly are intellectual property that the company values. The search ranking, for example, probably one of the most protected secrets of the company. Neither Jonathan nor I ever actually saw that code because it's held to a small enough group. Perfectly reasonable decision. So we're not suggesting that there's no intellectual property, but we're suggesting that for strategic reasons, you're better off creating platforms with free software that people can extend and build partnerships. You give up some control in return for a much larger pie. One of the secrets of the tech industry, and we talk about this in the book some, is that we win when our competitors win too. In the early years, Terry Semel, who's from Los Angeles and a good personal friend, was running Yahoo. And we learned fairly quickly to call and congratulate each other when we would win a deal. And the reason is that we knew that after he won one, a month or two later, that customer would also adopt the Google services or vice versa. And one day I realized, even though we were certainly competing on these deals and it was very rough, we were growing a market. And sometimes growing the pie is the best way to grow your own revenue.
And in a similar vein, just if I may, you talked about the 10x scaling. One of the phrases that I love in this that I plan to repeat often is to be proud of your competitors, but don't follow them. And what does that mean to be proud of your competitors? What's in that?
Well, if you follow your competitors, then you're kind of destined to just come up with sort of very incremental kinds of improvements. Your competitors probably aren't thinking 10x. They're thinking very incrementally. So if you stay focused on just what the competition is doing, even if they're just a little bit ahead of you, all you're going to do is leapfrog your competitor incrementally. So you want to be proud of them and your industry when they're able to do something that's significantly better. And rather than copy that, you want to try to figure out how can you sort of go back to what Eric was saying. Milton Friedman used to say that most economic fallacies come from the fact that people think that there's a fixed pie, and that what you win is what your competitor loses.
Yeah, so let me translate that to non-Milton Friedman fans. Basically, if you think of this as a zero-sum game, that is, I win and you lose, that kind of a thing, you're talking about a fixed market. But almost all markets grow for all sorts of reasons: population growth, distribution, and so forth. Tech has been growing at a huge rate because more users, more technology, more globalization, and so forth. So these rules apply in a special case to us.
Going back to the thinking about how you apply teams to this, there was another phrase that I loved in this, that you talked about how you staff things and how you keep people moving. And a lot of tech companies move people around. That's pretty common. But you had this phrase in there where you talked about make managers give away their M&Ms, let them keep their raisins.
So we came up with this, actually, it wasn't long after Halloween. We call it pass the M&Ms, keep the raisins. So I had a rule with the Associate Product Manager program that Marissa actually created, where we would hire people right out of school, and we would give them very big projects. And the rule was that they would work in one area for a year, and then we would rotate them. And we would have meetings where we would rotate. And it was like you have after Halloween, when the kids all get together and they take the pillowcases and they dump them on the table, and then they give everyone else the raisins, because nobody wants raisins.
I never understood this analogy, Jonathan.
So it's not that you don't like you like chocolate.
Yes.
You're a chocolate guy. Okay, well think of it. Think M&Ms are chocolate. We were thinking about you.
Chocolate M&Ms?
Yes.
As opposed to chocolate raisins?
So you force the people.
I'm hungry now.
You force the people to rank their people, and then move the very best ones. And I think what we've seen as a legacy of that is many of these APMs that we hired right out of school, now 10 years later, are the future leaders, are the current and future leaders of the company.
And that process of moving around makes them better able to contribute to that cycle of innovation?
And companies talk about doing this, but they never actually do it.
Right.
So what happens is that the employee has been there and doing a good job, and one day the employee decides that their career is not that interesting, and they leave the corporation. And because these are intellectual property businesses, that the knowledge in people's heads is everything, right? So finding ways of retaining your talent, right, growing their careers and so forth, it's really got to be the biggest priority for an executive.
And you have rewards like, which most people know very well, the 20% of your time. What are other ways that you're looking to keep people engaged in pursuing things that maybe you didn't even realize was that you chronicle several products that no one knew there was a market there. It developed after you got it out there.
Well, a simple rule is that people who will do stuff with you or without you are your best employees. Because they're going to come to work and you don't need to worry about them. They are incredibly motivated to come to work to do X, whatever X is. So we call this the Warren Buffett rule, because Larry and Sergey and I flew out to visit, in Omaha, Mr. Buffett, and he explained that he ran the entire enterprise with 14 employees, because he never actually managed the people. He just selected them because they would be self-managing. We love that idea, right? So you want people who are you don't have, as an executive, there's so much going on. If you're worried about person X, right, and their motivation, it's just going to cut your productivity down.
Right.
You also want to just keep giving them bigger, more exciting problems to solve. So if a Google employee comes to me and they're bored with search, or they're bored with ads, or they're bored with apps, or enterprise, or books, or images, or mobile, or geo, and none of that's enough for them, you send them over to Sergey into Google X, and they're building balloons, or they're working on robot cars, or they go over to the Fiber project. So the way you keep these smart, creative people motivated is you just keep letting them attack bigger and bigger problems.
I think the question that a lot of folks would be interested in is, a lot of what you're saying makes perfect sense when you're a company of 50 employees. But how do you preserve that as you scale up to 50,000 employees around the world? How does that, it seems like the plague of most companies is they get big and then they die a slow death of bureaucracy. And what keeps the juices going at Google?
What's interesting is people say that, but these companies have executives who are in charge of them.
Right.
I mean, they're not leaderless. And so to sit there and say, well, my company died because there's all this bureaucracy, and I'm the CEO, I mean, fix it.
Right.
right? So we talk in the book about fixing it, but the simplest answer is, if people are complaining about the bureaucracy, get rid of it. Take a few risks, right? We have all sorts of problems where you end up with, I used to call these people glue people, and that they were interstitial. They would sit between functions, and they were very, very nice people, but they didn't actually do anything.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I mean, I'm sure these people exist in other corporations as well. And so we would try very, very hard to not have glue people. You had to have a clear deliverable that mattered, right? And you had to be held accountable. And so you can build, our theory with Google was we would build a platform for systematic innovation. And that there's no limit to a model of empowerment with hard-driving people who are relatively free within some strategic framework to go after their things. The good news is we have lots of cash, lots of revenue coming in, which has been true for some time. So we have the runway to take you, if you want to do this, to go at it, but you better deliver, right? And we hold you accountable. And if you're not successful, we don't fire you. We just give you another project. Because we figure if you failed once, you're probably a lot more humble, and you're going to work even harder.
Right. Because now nobody likes failure, so now you're going to try to find that thing where you can prove your work.
Subject to the earlier Naves space vector
and
rule.
divas and hippos. One thing I wanted to talk a little bit about before we turn it over to the audience. Thinking about LA and Hollywood versus Silicon Valley. For years, there's been this discussion about convergence. I've been on the front lines of some of it, and for a long time it seemed like even though both sides liked fancy cars and made a lot of money and had an insular culture, they couldn't connect. And that is changing now.
Yeah, and I think actually you've made a big difference personally. And I think what happened was the technical people had to get enough of an infrastructure built that we actually had consumer products. And we finally now have consumer products as an industry, consumer brands, we have consumer reach, and people like yourself, you're good at that. You know how to talk to those people. Mm-hmm. So finally we can have the same conversation. As long as sort of the engineers in the engineering room and then the marketing people basically promoting movies, although they certainly had nice, pleasant, expensive dinners here, nothing actually happened.
Right. And Google has really, in more than most of the tech brands, you've got a 100,000 square foot facility here. You're really in town.
I should mention that we've made a huge investment in Los Angeles. We have many hundreds, 700, 800 employees in the greater Venice area. Mm-hmm. And we have a very large YouTube studio.
Right.
The studio is where many of our, basically, we of course run it algorithmically. We look at the sort of who are the top views, who are the most creative people on YouTube based on popularity. And then we call them, invite them, and they use our facilities to make even better things. And if you have a chance to visit, it's well worth it. It's quite interesting. It's a whole new generation of filmmakers, creative people. It feels like the birth of a new industry. Right. And we're very, very proud of that. It's probable, and I've spent some time in Los Angeles doing this, there's a whole new generation of small, essentially production companies that are focused on internet content. And they sort of analyzed that the future of video and entertainment is online, and that YouTube is the primary mechanism whereby people are going to reach these audiences, especially very young audiences. So our basic marketing pitch is that if you want to reach an audience, the demo is like 20 to 35-ish, you need to be on our platform first, and we give you those tools. We're very, very proud of this, and it's working incredibly well.
It makes sense. I mean, a client of our agency, Brian Robbins with Awesomeness TV, noticed that his kids weren't watching TV anymore. They were on YouTube.
Isn't that a great name, Awesomeness TV?
Well, yes.
You must have given them that name.
I was part of that, yeah.
Yes.
But, so thank you for that plug. But here's the question I wanted to kind of leave the audience with. Now that you've been around town and you've seen the way Hollywood works or doesn't work at times, and you've got these gold nuggets of insight in here, what's your advice if Hollywood wants to become more googly, what does it need to do?
I think, for first place, I think Hollywood's having a pretty good time, right?
It works.
Yeah.
It's a very different industry, but I think that people are always wondering how to change culture.
I guess a couple observations. There's no question in Hollywood it's similar to engineering teams at Google in that it's completely about the people, right? Yeah. If you read one of the other management books, Ed Catmull's book on Pixar, he talks about how originally the movie guys all thought that all that matters was the big idea, right? If you didn't have the right big idea, your movie wasn't going to be any good. And he observes in the book that if you give a great idea to a mediocre team, you end up with a mediocre product. And if you give a mediocre idea to a great team, they produce something that's fantastic. And I think that's very similar to kind of the iterate mentality that we have on our engineering teams. I think the other observation that I would have for Hollywood is I think we're going to see kind of two ends of a distribution in the production of content. We're going to continue to see sort of this hit-driven mentality of the great big movies and creative work, but we're also going to empower this new set of individuals who, at much, much lower cost, can create much more specialized content. And I think that's what we're seeing with YouTube. That's what we're seeing with a lot of the advertising products that we're developing.
The Maker Studios. That's
Maker Studios is...
One other comment is that when I look at the movie industry, which I know very little about, I see immense marketing budgets. That money could be more effectively analytically measured and spent, and I'm sure more of it would end up in our direction.
Right. I'm sure it would. And it's starting, slowly but surely, it's starting. Right. Let's open it up to the audience. I know we've got lots of questions.
Okay, a quick reminder, the way questions work at Live Talks LA, they generally start with a W or an H, sometimes a D. Business propositions phrased in the form of questions don't count. We do not believe in two-part questions, and only Larry Vincent gets to ask follow-up questions. The gentleman back there.
Hi, Eric, Jonathan, thank you for coming. My question is, of all of the wonderful projects and concepts that Google is working on, for each of you, what is your favorite? What are you most excited about?
Go ahead.
I've actually spent most of the last 3 years helping out at Motorola, so there's no question I'm going to say Android. I think what's so exciting about Android is not just what it's doing for us today, but at the rate at which we're adding new smartphones in the world, we're going to see 2.5 billion more people in the next 5 years get smartphones. And just imagine what the smartphone has done for you. And then ask yourself, what's the smartphone going to do for somebody in the third world? These people, in many cases, are going to have access to connectivity through Loon or other projects that we have. They're going to have a smartphone. Before that phone, they didn't get a newspaper. Before that phone, they didn't know what was going on with their government. Before that phone, they didn't know how to look up information on healthcare or crop rotation or how to build a well. So I'm most excited about the fact that all of those people are going to come online. They're going to join the collective conversation that we have online, and they're going to be able to engage in commerce with each other and with others online.
I agree with that. I would probably say the self-driving car. In order to actually take 2 tons and hurtle it down the highway at 70 miles an hour without somebody driving it, it's an extraordinary feat of science and technology. But more importantly, it will save lives.
I'm going to follow up with just one of your own stock questions. What surprised you about mobile and how it's evolved?
I think the big thing that surprised me was I always used to think that convergence was going to be at the device level. There was like going to be one thing that was going to do everything for me. And I've kept searching for what that thing was going to be. And it turns out that it's not going to be one thing. It's going to be lots of different screen sizes and lots of different devices. It's all going to converge in terms of where I store my data. I'm going to store my data in the cloud, but I'm going to have a wearable device. I might have a glass-oriented device, and I'm going to want lots of devices of different screen sizes. I'm very surprised that as most people thought about phones, they initially said, I want it smaller, because they thought of it like the StarTech phone instead of a supercomputer in your pocket.
Yeah.
Once we understood it was a supercomputer in our pocket, we wanted, the Samsung Galaxy Note or some other device that folks are catching
on now that
heard of at some point that has a bigger screen.
Hi, thanks you guys. I'm really excited about YouTube down here in LA, and I've been to the site. It's great. how do you propose to get older people on YouTube, old meaning like in their 30s and then their 40s, and then also baby boomers and all those people with serious money to spend that advertisers are going to want to go after? So how would you attract, how do you propose to get older people using YouTube, subscribing, etc.?
How do you age it up?
I think the secret is for everybody to use the Chromecast product. You know, if you think about my mother.
You say you're not a marketer, but I don't know.
My mother would be, my mother's 86, she'd be perfectly happy to watch her television with Chromecast where the source is YouTube. But I think we have to bridge between the old model and the new. People of this elder age, as you describe them, 30 and older, 35 and up, you know, they're not going to change their habits because they're so old, right? By the way, so we're clear, that was a joke.
So is that a good thing? Facebook has had that challenge in the past where as they aged up, it actually started to keep people from signing up. Do you see the same thing with channels like YouTube?
No, I think it's pretty clear that YouTube will be the primary way in which people watch video for a very long time, simply because of its reach and brand and all of the different offerings. I think we do need, as she points out quite well, we do need to get it onto the devices that those folks are watching. But YouTube is the amounts of video, the number of hours, and so forth. There's no confusion at this point.
It's also naturally moving quite aggressively to mobile. So I think as people get, again, larger phones, which we talked about a moment ago, it's very, very easy to use YouTube on a mobile device. The networks are much faster than they used to be. So I think anybody who gets a large form factor smartphone is going to get much more aggressive about using YouTube.
I mean, in the last 20 years, we've put enormous amounts of bandwidth in the internet around the world, and yet half of it seems to be going to the combination of Netflix and YouTube. That is an extraordinary fact to a scientist.
Yeah.
So
and when we have Google,
we care a lot about watching things.
And when we have Google Fiber in every city, then it will be a lot more.
Cannot happen soon enough.
I'm right there with you. Yes.
Hi. As Google is expanding beyond search, as it's going to Chrome and cars and possibly even rockets, what is the new identity of Google now? Or just what is Google?
We talk a lot about that. There's sort of the original mission to organize the world's information. I think it's moving more towards helping people make better decisions so they can live better lives, if I were to summarize it. And I think Google Now really does help you do that. In fact, it helped us do it just today. It was aware of where I was going. It was aware of the traffic. So I think it's moving to a model.
I don't think he actually meant the product Google Now. There's a product called Google Now, which uses AI techniques, Jonathan, to tell you what to do.
Explain that. Thank you. And apparently it's very successful. So
even you are using it, and you didn't know it.
I did know it.
Well, Google for the longest time was almost synonymous with search.
Yeah,
you've invested in a lot of new things.
No, but I think Larry and Sergey did not sit there and say we're a search company. Right. They said we're an information company. And I think if anything, we've broadened that to the way Jonathan phrased it, which is, can we make people's lives better? Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at the sum of all the products we've discussed, it's all the Google X things, it's all about making the end user happier. And if we can keep doing that, we're going to do just fine.
Do you have problems internally with do people debate, we shouldn't go into this because it's away from our knitting of the things that we do well?
Not really. We get that criticism from all sorts of people, and we just ignore it.
That works. You have another question?
Over here.
Thank you. Hi, I was wondering if you're worried about technology overuse by my generation, and what do you think about that?
We are so happy you use us all day and all night. An interesting statistic is that if you have a teenager, your teenager is connected. In your case, you might not have a teenager, you might be a teenager. If you have a teenager, your teenager is online from the time they're awake to the time they're asleep. And if they wake up in the middle of the night, they're online. Another interesting statistic is that 97% of people sleep with their mobile phones next to each other and on. right? And if they wake up in the moonlight, they take it. Now, am I describing you, or are you different? Okay. So I think, our job is to sort of, tee this up. And if that's your dad next to you, I'll let him decide how much of this you should be using.
So when you're making these big plans for, say, 5, 10 years down the line, how do you decide when it's time to maybe turn away from that plan because of adversity? Because this is such a rapidly changing market, you never know what's going to happen. So, yeah, how do you call it quits on something when it's time?
So I think first, we don't actually, in our offsites, ask people, so what's going to happen in the world 5 years from now? We ask them to just sort of imagine what could happen. People find it much easier to talk about what might happen as opposed to say, well, I know the following things are going to happen. I would say that the test of whether or not something is failing, I would give Regina Dubin, who came from DARPA, the quote. She says, we quit things when it's going to require multiple miracles in a row in order for them to succeed.
That's kind of part of what you had mentioned in the why business plans won't work, right? Is that there's only so far you can take it, and you have to constantly evaluate as circumstances and disruptions occur.
No, but I'll give you an example. People say you can't forecast the future. In general terms, we can say that in the next 5 years, people will still be using smartphones, and those smartphones will be a lot faster and a lot cheaper. We can say that cloud computing, which is sort of what Google does today, is going to be better, cheaper, faster. We can say that the network's going to be a lot faster, and we can show the rate of growth. We can talk about penetrations in countries that today have low penetrations, and we can estimate the scale. So just by doing some simple things like that, you can get a vision of what the market looks like, right? And then based on that, you can say, how well are we positioned? I'll give you an example. One of the surprises for me, I was on the Apple board when the iPhone first came out, and version 1 did not have open APIs. You could not do an app store. And so when version 2 came out, and I was still on the board, they hadn't kicked me off at that point, I remember thinking, well, that's sort of a clever idea, good. I didn't understand the impact of having millions of apps on iPhone and Android, which is defining the industry. So today, the conversation you would have would be, in 5 years, what will the apps be on top of these incredibly powerful smartphones? My own opinion, Jonathan and I spent a fair amount of time talking about this, is a lot of it's going to be health-related, medical-related, personal, helping people live their lives better. Well, you better have an answer to that. You better either be in that business or tolerate that business or not be opposed to that business, because it's probably going to happen.
But it raises another interesting question. Because of the work that Google has done, we have, you even write about this in the book, we got an abundance of capital and an abundance of information. But I think as a manager, how do you remind yourself to take a step back and say, this is going on and I need to think about it in my business because it's coming at you like a fire hose?
Because it's your job. I mean, again, I don't believe in people's excuses on this stuff. Your job is to have a 5-year plan, manage people the best you can, have incredibly exciting things, and change the world.
Right.
That's our goal, right? If you don't do that, you're not doing your job. Go work somewhere else.
Right. And when he comes into your office and you're the senior vice president of products and delivers that lecture, you go out and find the engineers and product managers in the company who really want to go deliver on those objectives.
Right. Right.
But my point is that the senior leadership is responsible for the tone of this. We can build better products. We can, in fact, do innovative things. I believe it. I believe we can physically do it. I believe you guys can do it too, but it takes fortitude.
Sometimes you have to put the thing on the bulletin board that said, these ads suck, and get people to respond. I think we might have a couple more questions.
Hi there. I wanted to ask you guys if you would share a little bit about any conversations that have happened or are currently happening about how you help work with YouTube influencers for paid content or sponsored content opportunities and how those are labeled. Twitch TV recently put a policy in place where that needs to be managed and disclosed, and I wanted to hear how you guys discuss that and manage that from the internal side for YouTube.
We've had lots of conversations on this, and I couldn't give you an accurate enough answer of where we are, but we're well aware of this issue. In general, we need to have everybody making money here. right? We need to increase the amount of monetization. We invented these ads called TrueView ads, which are the sort of skippable ads, and that has worked very well. We're trying to come up with other opportunities that don't violate the sense of, it has to be transparent, it has to be clear who paid for it, that kind of thing.
Hi. You guys talk a lot about incumbency in the book, and I'm wondering how you define it. Is incumbency about the act of existing already, or is incumbency about the lack of innovation? And would you consider Google to be an incumbent?
Again, we may have different answers. To me, incumbency is that you're there and you have a challenger. You have an incumbent and a challenger. Incumbents can be challengers as well. You can, do it. To me, the problem of incumbency is that you begin to take things for granted. You begin to believe your own religion. You believe that you're better than anyone else. We spend every day at Google believing that the people at Apple, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth are just as good as we are, right? Different systems, different values, but basically good people who are quick, right? So we spend all day saying, well, what are they doing? What are we doing? Are we doing a better job? And so forth. Have we really invented something new, or are we busy falling into the trap that Jonathan described earlier? Are we beginning to copy them? How do we do something new that changes the world?
Yeah, when we talk about the problem of incumbents, I tend to think about incumbents who realize that they're being attacked and focus on the fact that they're being attacked by using lobbyists to focus on solving the problem with regulation as opposed to attacking back with innovation. And I think Uber and the taxi industry is probably a good example.
In Hollywood, there were executives who initially tried to fight some of this new online world. I'm pleased to report now that every studio, every major content manufacturer, developer, in the whole industry that is Los Angeles, is a YouTube partner, is a Google partner, right? It's a real breakthrough. So that's an example where incumbents might have fought us are now partnering with us.
Steve Jobs often said that it's better to be a pirate than the Navy, right? He was famous for that. Is that still the case? Is it still better to be the challenger and to get in and to disrupt things, or what is that distinction in your minds?
There's a romantic notion to the story of the Macintosh and Steve put them in a separate building on the Cupertino campus and they put a pirate flag up. And the part of that story that isn't told is that the Mac almost didn't make it, did not have a lot of internal political support. It was right on the edge. Go play with it, you'll see. And I think that the fact that because of the internal politics, it suffered for some years because of that. It's much better not to use that kind of adversarial language, in my view, inside of companies. It's much better to say, we just want you to invent great stuff.
Right.
Right. What do you need? Run as fast as you can. And we'll help you sort out whether your thing's any good or not. And what I do, because we have lots of arrogant engineers, as everyone does, is they all come into me and say, well, what do you think of my product? I'm sure this happens in your industry as well. And I say, I love it, but it doesn't matter. And that could have annoyed them a little bit. And I say, well, I really like it. I think you've done a great job, but my opinion doesn't matter at all. And they go, okay. I said, because I'm not the judge. Your user is the judge. And I'm going to micro-measure that, and I will know exactly how well you did. And they go, okay, go back to work, right?
The powerful force of the market.
Yeah.
Questions?
2 more questions.
Among all the awesome products that Google has, I wonder what your point of view is as far as Google Voice Mail. It's an app that I was discussing with a friend today, and she was telling me how much she loves it, and she likes using it because it makes her life simpler. So I wonder what your perspective is as far as the app, as the outcome in the next 5 years.
So I love Google Voice. I never listen to voicemail anymore. I get the tone of it through the transcriptions. We're moving to a model where voice is really integrated along with text into Google Hangouts. And I think we've already got a reasonably robust app there that people are testing. So I use voice all the time. I think we're just moving from what was the original Google Voice app into integrating it so that it's much more seamless in terms of using it with your contacts and using it on your desktop with Hangouts?
One of the stories that's not been told that much is it appears that there have been phenomenal breakthroughs in voice recognition in the last 4 or 5 years because of powerful supercomputers. And so the quality of voice recognition today is sort of eerily good. And we're seeing similar things with video recognition as well as text recognition.
Seems like tell me that I answered the wrong question.
Your answer was fine. Jonathan uses Google Voice. I call his voice number, right?
Yes.
It seems like that will be an amazing step forward when we have better ability to, as you're already doing, in searching images and searching through videos.
Yeah. The speculative part is we're very close to being able to have very good recognition and understanding of what's in a movie, in a video, in a picture, as I mentioned, text as well as voice. At that point, what's possible? Well, we can set computers out to learn what's going on. And so the most famous of these studies is that Google 2 years ago built a neural network, which is a form of computers that were linked together that didn't know anything, literally knew nothing. It was unprogrammed. And we set it off to watch YouTube. And it watched YouTube for 11,000 hours. What did it discover? 2 things. It discovered the human face, eyes, nose, and mouth. And the second thing it discovered was cats. And it didn't just discover the furry part of the cat. The whole concept of a cat. It had a cat tail and the cat motion and so forth. Now, you would have hoped that in this historic event, the first time a computer has discovered a new concept, it had discovered, Plato or Aristotle or something, or math or physics, but we discovered cats.
Yeah. Andrew Lloyd Webber is very happy.
We're trying to figure out what to do with this discovery of cats.
One more question.
And our final question for the evening.
Hey, thanks for coming. This one's about the self-driving car. How does Google plan to address the ethical and moral dilemma raised by a situation in which a self-driving car has to choose between saving the life of its passenger or a pedestrian or another driver? Specifically, like, who makes the call?
Well, by the way, that's actually a new question for me anyway. But let me take you through the way we would think about that. So the first point is, self-driving cars are not going to be accident-free, but they're going to have fewer accidents than people-driven cars, right? So that's the first principle. So if you assume that the self-driving car can never have an accident versus the cars that are driven by drunk people and or your teenager learning to drive, you've got to really sort of think about what the goal is. I think the goal should be to reduce the horrific number of deaths and injuries that occur on the highways. The number is more than 31,000 people in America. These are our family members, our friends, citizens here. Obviously around the world it's even worse. So I think that should be our goal. So the technical answer to your question is that these would be a split-second decision, and it would be determined by the computation that the radar, it's actually a laser, is doing about how to stop. The reality is that these kinds of cars are going to have such good crashworthiness that they should be able to do both, that they should be able to stop to protect the pedestrian as well as the car. Now, the reality is you need to have your seatbelt on and all that kind of stuff. So it's more than a simple answer, but there's no A or B test, kill the dog, kill the person, kill the policeman, kill you, right?
The dog.
I got that, Jonathan. Or the cat.
But it's a very interesting point you bring up because you're a pilot. This has been around in aviation for a long time. 2 planes coming at each other. The computer saves lives by deciding who descends and who.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interesting is that the AI technology can now do quite accurate see and avoid. So one of the reasons to think that these devices will be a great deal safer is that they will autonomously be able to say, I'm avoiding this subject. Now, the question was a particularly tough one,
right?
Which is when you have to make a life decision.
How do you choose?
And my guess is that's going to be an extremely rare event and one but so rare that, I mean, we'll spend a lot of time thinking about it. But the more important thing to know is that all of these autonomous things, whether it's cars or other kind of autonomous vehicles, they're going to have automatic ways to avoid hitting anybody. As you mentioned with pilots, and I'm a commercial pilot as a hobby, when two airplanes are closing in, you get a command that's calculated between the computers in both airplanes. And the law requires the following. It requires the professional pilot to follow what the computer says and not what the air traffic controller says. Interesting. And in case you're wondering, look up the Swiss air crash that occurred over Switzerland, where one of the pilots ignored this decision, allegedly, and boom, they hit each other.
Right. So the book is How Google Works. We'll leave on that note. You have changed everyone in this room's life through
Can we take a minute
happened.
and thank the LA Live Talks, Larry, Ted. This is a fantastic venue. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.